Have you ever wondered why the fantasies that live inside our minds can feel more powerful than the experiences we have in real life? Why something imagined, a scene, a touch, a look, can ignite a desire so strong it feels almost tangible? Today, we're diving into the hidden psychology of fantasy, how our brains build these private worlds, how desire takes shape within them, and what happens when those fantasies collide with real fulfillment. Because the truth is, what turns us on isn't just about the body, it's about the stories we tell ourselves, the emotions we chase, and the deep human need to feel seen, desired, and free. Imagine this: you're lying awake at night, the world quiet, your mind wandering into that private space where reality starts to blur with imagination. Maybe it's someone you know, maybe it's someone you've never met, maybe it's a scene so vivid it almost feels like memory. You can feel your pulse change, your breathing deepen. And yet nothing has actually happened. That's the power of fantasy. It doesn't just live in your mind, it reshapes your body, your emotions, your chemistry. When psychologists study fantasy, they're not just studying what we think about, they're studying the language of desire itself. Research shows that over 95% of people have sexual fantasies. But what's truly fascinating is that most of us fantasize not to escape reality, but to understand it better. In those imagined moments, we reveal parts of ourselves we don't always show. Our curiosity, our fears, our longing for control, our craving for surrender. Fantasy is like holding up a mirror to the secret self, the one we edit out of our everyday lives. What your fantasies say about you isn't always obvious. For instance, people who frequently imagine being desired, watched, or admired aren't necessarily narcissistic. They're often expressing a deep need for validation, for feeling irresistible in someone's eyes. Others who fantasize about dominance or submission are often exploring psychological balance, flipping the power dynamics of their waking life. A person who carries a lot of responsibility might fantasize about letting go. Someone who feels unseen might imagine being completely taken, wanted, chosen. In fantasy, the mind builds worlds where we can rewrite the emotional script of our lives, not to escape, but to feel whole. Neuroscience actually backs this up. When you imagine a sexual scenario, the same regions of your brain that light up during real arousal, the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the nucleus accumbens, all become active. Your brain can't fully tell the difference between what's vividly imagined and what's physically real. That's why a fantasy can make your heart race and your body respond. In that moment, your nervous system is living the experience. It's not fiction to your body, it's embodied imagination. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Not all fantasies are about sex in the literal sense. Many are about emotion, connection, risk, vulnerability, even rebellion. Some people fantasize about being with someone forbidden not because of who that person is, but because of what they represent: danger, novelty, freedom. Others fantasize about being adored, worshipped, or dominated because it gives them access to feelings they don't often allow themselves: power, surrender, release. In other words, the fantasy isn't always about the act, it's about the emotional energy behind it. Think about it: a fantasy of being with someone mysterious isn't just about attraction. It's about wanting to be seen differently, to feel a part of yourself awaken that everyday life numbs. A fantasy about dominance might actually be about safety, knowing someone else is in control, that you can let go without consequence. Even fantasies that seem taboo often carry psychological wisdom. They challenge our sense of identity, they expand our empathy, and they help us explore our emotional boundaries safely in the privacy of our own minds. There's a reason fantasies tend to emerge during stress, loneliness, or transitions. They're a coping mechanism, the brain's way of restoring emotional equilibrium. Studies have found that people who allow themselves to fantasize regularly often have better sexual satisfaction, higher self-esteem, and more creativity. It's as if fantasy provides a rehearsal space for intimacy, a place to practice, explore, and reimagine what pleasure and connection could mean. Of course, not every fantasy is meant to be acted out, and that's one of the most misunderstood truths about desire. The human mind doesn't always draw a clean line between what it wants to happen and what it wants to imagine. There's a psychological distinction between fantasy and intent. Fantasies often serve symbolic purposes. They express emotions we might never want to physically live out. They give our psyche room to play, to push limits without consequence. A person can fantasize about something forbidden and still have zero interest in making it real, because the fantasy is about the idea, not the act. In fact, suppressing fantasies can sometimes have the opposite effect. The more we try not to think about something, the more powerful it becomes. It's called the rebound effect, a phenomenon well documented in cognitive psychology. The classic study involved participants who were told not to think about a white bear. Of course, all they could think about was the white bear. The same principle applies to desire. When we try to repress what turns us on, it doesn't disappear, it hides, it intensifies, and it often resurfaces in other ways. This is why understanding your fantasies can be such a revealing form of self knowledge. When you stop judging them and start listening to them, they start to make sense. They tell you what you crave emotionally. They highlight what you're missing: excitement, novelty, safety, freedom, affection. Fantasies are like emotional blueprints. They point toward needs that may not be met in daily life. And that's where the mirror metaphor becomes powerful, because fantasy doesn't just reflect what we want, it reflects what we feel we can't have. It's shaped by culture, by shame, by experience. For instance, people raised in sexually conservative environments often report more intense or taboo fantasies. The forbidden becomes the fuel. When something is culturally off limits, the mind reclaims it through imagination. It's a kind of rebellion, desire's way of asserting itself against the rules. Gender and orientation add even more layers to this. Research by the Kinsey Institute shows that men's fantasies tend to be more visual and scenario driven, while women's often emphasize emotional context and sensory detail. But these aren't rigid categories, they're overlapping tendencies. What's more interesting is that across all identities, the themes are remarkably similar: being desired, being in control, breaking boundaries, feeling safe in surrender. We may express desire differently, but we're all speaking the same emotional language. And this language starts early, even before sexual awareness. Children engage in imaginative play that mirrors later fantasy, pretending to be powerful, admired, chosen. As adults, that play evolves into erotic imagination. The brain learns to pair pleasure with imagination, creating neural pathways that connect curiosity with arousal. It's no wonder fantasy can be so enduring. It's wired into how we experience emotion itself. Now, some people worry that fantasy can harm relationships, that imagining others is a sign of dissatisfaction. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, studies show that people who share or at least acknowledge their fantasies tend to have stronger relationships. The act of being honest, even privately honest with yourself, reduces shame and increases communication. It opens a doorway for intimacy. The danger isn't in fantasy itself, but in secrecy and fear. When we see fantasy as a normal, even healthy part of desire, it stops being a threat and becomes a tool for connection. There's a beautiful irony here: fantasy can make reality better. When couples talk about their fantasies, they often report feeling more emotionally bonded, even if they never act them out. It's because fantasy reveals vulnerability. It's a way of saying, here's what excites me, here's how my mind works. That kind of openness deepens trust, and in turn, trust deepens pleasure. Neuroscientifically, it makes sense. The brain's pleasure circuits, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, all respond not just to touch, but to imagination. When we share or even privately explore fantasy, we're stimulating the same systems that make love feel alive. It's like feeding the relationship from the inside out. But fantasy can also serve as a kind of diagnostic tool. If someone's fantasies start to shift dramatically, for example, from intimacy to avoidance, or from emotional closeness to control, it can reflect changes in psychological state. Our erotic imagination is sensitive to stress, trauma, and unmet needs. It's one of the first places our emotional life leaves clues. A recurring fantasy about being unseen might reveal loneliness. One about being overpowered might indicate a craving for safety. If we listen closely, our fantasies speak the language of our deeper selves. There's also something profoundly creative about fantasy. The same mental processes used in sexual imagination, mental simulation, emotional projection, sensory visualization, are the ones that artists, writers, and inventors use. Desire and creativity share neural pathways. In a sense, erotic fantasy is the brain's original art form, the way we sculpt emotion into imagery. No wonder it feels so intoxicating. And yet we often treat fantasy as something to hide. We fear judgment, rejection, misunderstanding. But when we realize that fantasy is a universal part of being human, it becomes something else, not shameful, but sacred, a space where the conscious and the unconscious meet. So here's a thought: what if we stopped treating fantasy as something separate from real life and started seeing it as a conversation with ourselves? Because in a way, every fantasy is a question. What do I want to feel? What do I fear? What part of me am I denying? It's not always about sex. It's about self-awareness, emotional truth, and the endless human search for connection. The science of fantasy tells us that desire isn't random, it's meaningful. It's storytelling through sensation. When you explore your fantasies with curiosity rather than shame, you start to uncover patterns. Maybe you notice you're drawn to scenarios where you're pursued. That might mean you crave affirmation. Or maybe you often imagine being in control, which could point to a desire for agency or safety. When we decode these inner worlds, we start to understand ourselves at a level most people never reach. And here's where fulfillment enters the picture. Because fantasy alone isn't the destination, it's a bridge. The most satisfying relationships, sexually and emotionally, are the ones where imagination meets authenticity, where partners can translate fantasy into connection, even if it stays in the realm of conversation or playful suggestion. Fulfillment doesn't come from acting out everything you imagine. It comes from feeling emotionally free enough to explore without fear. Think of it like this: fantasy is the body's way of dreaming. Just as night dreams help us process emotions and experiences, erotic fantasies help us integrate our desires and insecurities. They're the mind's way of maintaining emotional balance. The more we accept them, the more integrated we become. So the next time a fantasy crosses your mind, instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" try asking, "What is this trying to tell me?" Because beneath every fantasy lies a truth about who you are, what you long for, and what makes you feel alive. It's not a mask you wear, it's a mirror reflecting the parts of you that deserve to be seen. And maybe that's the greatest gift of fantasy. It gives us permission to imagine, to play, to rediscover wonder and desire. It reminds us that sexuality isn't just about what happens in the body, it's about the stories that shape how we love, how we connect, and how we understand ourselves. In that sense, fantasy isn't an escape from reality at all. It's the most intimate dialogue we have with our own truth. Imagine for a moment that every fantasy you've ever had, every spark of desire, every scene that played out in your imagination wasn't just a story in your head, but a piece of emotional truth trying to find its way into the real world. Because fulfillment, as strange as it sounds, isn't about fantasy alone. And it's not about physical experience alone either. It's about the moment those two worlds meet, when imagination finally touches reality, when what you dream begins to breathe. You see, the human brain doesn't separate mind from body the way we think it does. Desire, scientifically speaking, is both psychological and biological, a loop of emotion, memory, and sensation feeding into each other. When we imagine something erotic, the same regions that process touch, pleasure, and emotional intimacy all light up. The body starts preparing as if the fantasy were real. But here's the catch: when that imagined moment actually happens, if it doesn't connect to the emotional truth that inspired it, it can feel strangely hollow. Fulfillment, in other words, is not about replicating a fantasy, it's about feeling the meaning behind it. There's a fascinating study from the Kinsey Institute where researchers asked people to describe their most recurring sexual fantasies and then compare those to the real experiences that felt most satisfying. The overlap wasn't perfect. Many participants said the most physically thrilling encounters weren't the ones that matched their fantasies word for word. They were the ones that captured the emotion of the fantasy. If someone imagined being desired completely, the fulfilling moment wasn't necessarily a wild sexual adventure. It was the look in their partner's eyes that said, "I want you." The emotional tone mattered more than the script. Our brains are wired for that kind of emotional resonance. When you're touched in a way that feels emotionally aligned, when there's trust, safety, or genuine curiosity, the brain releases not just dopamine, the chemical of reward, but oxytocin, the chemical of bonding. That's what transforms pleasure into intimacy. Oxytocin makes touch feel meaningful. It's what makes a kiss linger in memory longer than an orgasm. And that's why the union of fantasy and reality can be so profound. It gives both the mind and the body something to hold on to. But it's not always easy to bridge those two worlds. In fantasy, you're free, you control every detail, you can create perfect timing, perfect chemistry, even perfect vulnerability. In reality, desire is messy, people misunderstand each other, timing is off, self-consciousness creeps in. And yet that's also what makes it beautiful, because fulfillment isn't about perfection, it's about authenticity. It's the moment you stop performing and start feeling. The paradox of desire is that the more we try to control it, the less alive it feels. But when we allow it to unfold, when imagination becomes a guide rather than a script, that's when connection deepens. This idea that fulfillment happens when imagination meets emotional honesty runs deep in psychology. Freud once wrote that fantasy was the royal road to understanding desire, but modern sex research takes it a step further. Fantasy is also the rehearsal for real connection. When you imagine, you're exploring not just what turns you on, but what makes you feel emotionally alive. You're practicing intimacy in the theater of your mind. And when those rehearsals meet the right partner, someone you can be open with, someone who listens, someone curious enough to explore with you, the line between mental pleasure and physical experience dissolves. There's a fascinating neurological detail here during both fantasy and physical intimacy. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles logic and inhibition, actually quiets down. That's why sex and imagination both feel like states of flow. Time blurs, self consciousness fades. What you're left with is raw experience, the body and the mind moving together. And this shared state of immersion is what creates that elusive sense of fulfillment. You're not thinking about how you look or whether you're doing it right. You're simply in it. One of the most misunderstood truths about desire is that fantasy isn't meant to replace reality, it's meant to enhance it. It gives us access to emotions that might be hard to reach otherwise. For example, a fantasy about being pursued might not be about dominance at all. It might be about wanting to feel chosen, special, undeniable. When that emotional layer is recognized and brought into a real connection, it transforms the experience. Suddenly, what might have been a physical act becomes an emotional awakening. This is why communication is the bridge between fantasy and fulfillment. When couples can talk about what they imagine, not as demands but as curiosities, they start to translate fantasy into intimacy. One partner might say, I've always imagined being completely in your control, while what they really mean is, I want to feel safe enough to let go. Another might say, I've fantasized about watching you, which might translate emotionally to, I want to see you fully without you hiding. These translations are where real intimacy is born. Because once the emotional truth of a fantasy is shared, it stops being just an idea. It becomes a shared experience. In one study, couples who regularly discussed their fantasies reported higher relationship satisfaction and better communication overall. They weren't necessarily acting them out. Often, just the act of sharing created closeness. That's because being honest about desire requires vulnerability, and vulnerability releases oxytocin. It deepens connection at a biological level. So, fulfillment isn't just about pleasure, it's about trust. When the mind feels safe enough to reveal its imagination, the body follows. Think about how that plays out in real life. When two people are emotionally open, even the smallest touch can feel electric. It's not the technique, it's the emotional charge behind it. Your brain interprets that touch as meaning something more. It says, I'm seen, I'm wanted, I'm free to be myself. That's when fantasy stops being an escape and starts becoming an expansion of real life. But the reverse can happen too. When imagination is disconnected from emotional reality, even the most physically intense experiences can feel strangely empty. People often describe this as feeling numb or disconnected during sex. What's happening there is a mismatch. The body is present, but the mind isn't emotionally engaged. The fantasy hasn't been integrated. That's why Afterglow, that feeling of deep satisfaction that lingers after intimacy, isn't just about orgasm, it's about emotional alignment. The body releases serotonin and oxytocin not only in response to pleasure but to connection. It's the body's way of saying, this meant something. Interestingly, this idea of fulfillment extends beyond the bedroom. When people engage in activities that match their inner fantasies, whether it's art, music, adventure, or love, the same chemistry applies. Dopamine rises, oxytocin stabilizes it, and serotonin seals it into memory. Fulfillment is a neurochemical balance between excitement and safety, novelty and belonging. That's why long term relationships thrive not just on love, but on play. Imagination keeps the dopamine alive, emotional security sustains the oxytocin. Desire at its healthiest is a dance between the two. Some people think desire fades over time, but research tells a different story. Desire doesn't vanish, it just needs new stories to grow in. When partners continue to be curious about each other's minds, they're shifting fantasies, they're changing emotions, desire evolves into something deeper. It becomes more psychological, more layered, more human. The fantasy of being desired might turn into the fantasy of being understood. The fantasy of mystery might become the fantasy of emotional transparency. As we change, so do the stories that turn us on. That's why fulfillment is never static. It's not a finish line, it's a dialogue. Every fantasy you have is an invitation to discover something about yourself. Every intimate moment is an opportunity to bring that discovery to life. The most satisfying connections happen when we stop trying to live up to someone else's fantasy and start co creating our own. Because in that shared imagination, we find something rare, not perfection, but presence. Biologically, this presence is powerful. When two people are fully attuned to each other, emotionally, mentally, physically, their heart rates sync, their breathing synchronizes, even their brainwaves start to align. It's called interpersonal resonance. Studies using fMRI scans have shown that during moments of deep connection, couples literally fall into neural harmony. Their brains begin to operate like one shared network. That's fulfillment at the deepest level. Two minds synchronizing through emotion and touch. And yet, fulfillment also requires individuality. It's not about merging into one person, it's about two distinct people choosing to meet at the edge of their imaginations. Fantasy keeps that individuality alive. It reminds us that desire isn't something we owe, it's something we share. It's the part of ourselves that stays curious, that keeps love from becoming routine. The most connected couples aren't the ones who do everything together. They're the ones who continue to explore each other's inner worlds. So when we talk about fulfillment, we're really talking about emotional freedom, the freedom to imagine, to express, to connect, the freedom to let your inner world be seen. Because when imagination is stifled, desire begins to fade. But when it's honored, when it's allowed to coexist with honesty,
Mm.
the relationship becomes a living thing. It breathes, it changes, it grows. Fulfillment then isn't about constant intensity, it's about balance. It's about knowing when to surrender to fantasy and when to anchor in reality. Too much fantasy and you risk disconnection, too much realism and you lose magic. The most satisfying lives, the most satisfying loves are the ones that move between those two states effortlessly, grounded in truth, but open to possibility. That's what I find so fascinating about human sexuality. It's not just biology or psychology, it's storytelling. Every fantasy is a story we tell ourselves about who we are and who we want to become. Every act of intimacy is an opportunity to write that story together. When those stories align, when they stop competing and start conversing, fulfillment emerges naturally. And maybe that's the secret we've been missing all along. Desire isn't something we have to chase, it's something we have to understand. It's not about doing more, it's about feeling deeper. Because at its core, desire isn't about lust, it's about longing, the longing to connect, to be seen, to be known. And when we allow fantasy and reality to meet in that honest space, we find isn't just pleasure, it's meaning. So the next time your mind drifts into a fantasy, don't rush to dismiss it or analyze it. Let it speak. Ask what emotion it's trying to express, what need it's trying to meet, then bring that insight into your real relationships, into how you touch, how you listen, how you love. That's how fantasy becomes fulfillment. It's not about acting out a scene, it's about embodying the feeling behind it. Because the truth is, fulfillment isn't found in escaping reality. It's found in enriching it. It's the art of making the imagined feel real and the real feel alive. When imagination meets honesty, when mind and body finally speak the same language, that's when we discover what true desire was always meant to be. Not just pleasure, but connection. Not just arousal, but understanding. Not just fantasy, but fulfillment.